Night falls over the small town of Havenbrook. A man, visibly scared, runs through the forest, running away from something in the shadows. He stumbles, looks back, and what pursues him is just emptiness. There is no form, but the presence is oppressive. He screams, but the sound is muffled. Shadows beneath. Episode 1. Lucas Foster had been missing for 3 days. The small town of Havenbrook, surrounded by dense forests, was used to isolation, but recent disappearances have begun to worry residents. The mayor, Elena, was meeting with a small city council team. In the dimly lit city hall room, the atmosphere was tense. Lucas's name was just the latest in a growing list of people who have mysteriously disappeared in the forests around the city. Silence filled the air as the tired faces of his colleagues showed growing pressure. "How long has this been going on?" asked Tom Willis, chief of the local police. His eyes were tired, and his tone made it clear that he was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. "Elena, it's already the 3rd one this year. If we don't start taking action, people will start to question what's going on here," said Maria Thompson, a local journalist whose recent reporting on the disappearances was gaining attention. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of leadership. "The truth is that we have no concrete evidence. Just rumors about what's happening in the forest. No one has the courage to go beyond the main trail to investigate." As the meeting continued, a conversation gradually turned from real concerns to assumptions and theories, and it was at that moment that the door to the room was abruptly opened. A man no one expected to see again entered the room. John Harris, a Havenbrook resident who had disappeared years before, returned to town to surprise everyone. John was visibly aged, with tired eyes and deep scars on his face, as if he had spent years fighting something no one could have imagined. "They are not lost," he said, his tone somber. "You have to understand, they were taken." The council paused for a moment in shock at the return of someone who had previously been presumed dead. "What do you mean by that, John? Where have you been?" Elena said, eyes wide. John, still looking tense, took a deep breath. "The shadows, they're not normal. They're moving, they're alive." The tone of his voice seemed darker than anything else said that night. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, a group of teenagers decide to go out in search of fun, ignoring their parents' warnings about the danger. Sarah, Mike, Danny, and Claire were childhood friends and always loved exploring the forest around the city. To them, the legends and stories circulating about disappearances were just that, legends. That night, they planned to go to the old Miners' Trail, a place abandoned for years but surrounded by macabre stories. "Are you sure about this?" asked Sarah, the most cautious of the group. She had heard the stories before, and although she liked adventures, something about that night made her nervous. "Oh, come on. They're just stories to scare children," said Mike, always the boldest one. "Besides, if you really believe in these things, why don't you build a fire and tell us the old stories of Havenbrook?" With flashlights in hand and backpacks on their backs, the 4 friends set off along the dark forest trail. The moon partially illuminated the path, but there was something in the surrounding darkness that seemed thicker than usual. Throughout, the sound of the wind whistled through the trees, but as they went further, Sarah began to notice that the wind wasn't just moving around them, it seemed to whisper. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, stopping abruptly. The others laughed at his occurrence, but soon realized that something was different. The air around became heavier, and even Claire, the most skeptical one, tensed. "Maybe we should go back?" Mike scoffed, but before we could continue they heard a loud crack in the trees. Everyone turned at the same time, lighting the way with their flashlights. Nothing. Only the shadows of the trees surround them. The silence returned, but now it was more disturbing. Danny stepped forward, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the damp earth of the trail. "We're not the only people here," Sarah whispered. They continued, but now in complete silence, their eyes scanning the darkness around them. The shadows between the trees moved, taking shapes that their brains tried to rationalize. But then, suddenly, what was just paranoia became real. In the distance, a figure appeared in the fog. A man standing still, looking directly at them without moving. At first he looked like a local, but his stillness was unnatural. His clothes looked old, dirty, and torn. The teenagers watched him, not knowing what to do. "Hey?" Mike, breaking the silence. But the man didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, with the fog close to his body. A second later, the figure disappeared, as if swallowed by shadows. The group suffered a shock, not understanding what had just happened. Mike, trying to remain calm, suggested they go back. But before he could move, the shadows around him could get closer. They were not just trees or plants, but something alive, something conscious. The whispers grew louder, echoing in their heads. Sarah held Claire's hand, feeling her panic rising. "Something's wrong here, we need to leave now." They ran as fast as they could, back to the city, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave them. From time to time, denser shadows continued to move between the trees, as if something or someone was chasing them. Meanwhile, in downtown Havenbrook, Elena and John continue their conversation. John, who had already experienced the terror of the forest, spoke with a tone of urgency. "The shadows, they don't move by themselves. They are hunting. If no one does anything, everyone here will disappear one by one." Elena tried to rationalize what she was hearing. "That doesn't make sense, John. How can shadows?" John interrupted. "You think I'm crazy. But I lived through it. I survived because they let me come back. But now they're stronger. They're coming to town." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of shouting throughout. It was a group of teenagers running through the forest, desperate. When they arrived at the central square, they were pale and out of breath. They told what they had seen, but no one believed them. "It was just fear, you're tired," said Tom Willis, trying to reassure them. But the teenagers knew it wasn't just tiredness or imagination. There was something in the forest, something no one else wanted to admit. And so, the first episode ends with the threat of shadows descending upon the town of Havenbrook, with the teens scarred by the terrifying encounter and John trying to warn of the approaching evil. After the desperate return of the group of teenagers, the atmosphere in the city of Havenbrook begins to change. Sarah, Danny, and Claire try to explain what happened in the forest, but no one really believes what they saw. Mike, however, is missing. The shadows that surrounded them continued to haunt Sarah's mind, and she couldn't forget what she saw, that motionless figure in the fog, the way it disappeared as if it had been consumed by darkness. In the days that follow, the tension increases. John Harris, the mysterious returned resident, warns Elena that something much more dangerous is happening. He remembers the time he was missing. "I wasn't lost. They trapped me in the shadows, they let me go because it wasn't time yet. But they're coming back for more, and they won't stop." Meanwhile, strange things seem to start happening in the city. Lights begin to flicker, and residents report feeling a presence in the dark streets at night. Objects move on their own, and whispers echo through the city as the sun sets. The shadows seem to grow, occupying spaces that were previously illuminated. Some say they hear voices, but whenever they try to get closer, they are enveloped by a paralyzing sense of dread. The teenagers, now terrified, come together again. Danny, always the more practical one, tries to convince the others that they need to go back to the forest to find Mike, but Sarah is terrified. "We can't go back there. Did you see what happened? They're waiting for us." But the guilt consumes them. They finally decide to return to the place where we last saw Mike. However, the forest now seems even denser and more hostile. The air is heavier, and the absolute silence is interrupted only by the whispers that echo among the trees again. This time they're not just shadows, they're figures, human shapes made of pure darkness, moving between the trees, slowly approaching as if waiting for the teens to step deeper into shadow territory. Meanwhile, Elena and John try to convince the Havenbrook authorities to act, but no one truly believes John's warnings. "This is crazy, Harris. Living shadows? You're imagining things," says Police Chief Tom Willis. But that night, everything changes. An announcement hits the city. The streets are completely dark and shadows take over Havenbrook. People begin to mysteriously disappear in their own homes, and whispers run through the empty streets. The entire city is gripped by growing panic, and suddenly no one feels safe anymore. The teenagers, now in the forest, find themselves surrounded by shadows. Danny, trying to be the brave one, steps forward in an attempt to tackle whatever is moving through the trees. But as he gets closer, the shadows envelop him. He tries to scream, but the sound is muffled as if the very air is being sucked from his throat. The others, paralyzed by fear, can only watch as he disappears before their eyes. The terror they feel is indescribable. Sarah and Claire flee, running aimlessly, trying to escape the shadows that pursue them. But as they advance, the darkness seems to close in around them, growing stronger and stronger. In the city, Elena and John know that time is running out. They need to find out what's behind the shadows before everyone in Havenbrook disappears. The town of Havenbrook was plunged into chaos after the camp. Shadows took over the streets and the fear was now palpable. Inside the forest, Sarah and Claire run desperately, but the shadows move faster, enveloping every inch of their path. The forest, which was once familiar, now seemed like a maze with no way out. The feeling of being watched by something invisible only grew. Sarah trips and falls to the damp floor, her breathing labored and her eyes wide. She tries to stand up, but her limbs feel heavy, as if an invisible force is draining her energy. Claire stops abruptly, trying to help her friend, but around her the shadows begin to close in, taking on almost human shapes, like specters that float around them. The voices that were once directed now echo closer, like voices wanting to communicate directly with them. Suddenly, John Harris appears at the entrance to the forest. Having realized what was happening, he rushed to save the girls. John shouts their names, but his voice seems swallowed by the wind and the suggestions of the shadows. He carries a flashlight and a bag of curios or relics he collected during the time he was missing. Inside the bag are symbols engraved on stones and amulets, things he believed could save or were waiting in the darkness. As John approaches, he turns on a flashlight, casting a beam of light that cuts through the shadows around Sarah and Claire. For a brief moment, the land seems to lighten, and the shadows recede, but João knows it won't last. He hands an amulet to Sarah, who holds it tightly, feeling the energy pulse in her hands. "They're stronger than ever," John whispers. "If we don't stop now, the entire city will be consumed." Elena, on the other hand, is back downtown trying to maintain order. Chaos and disappearances are multiplying, and the city is on the brink of despair. Police Chief Tom Willis finally believes something supernatural is happening, but it's too late to control the panic. In the forest, the shadows begin to fight back, stronger, faster. John's flashlight begins to fail, and the amulets don't seem to be enough to contain the strength of the entities that inhabit the darkness. With a desperate decision, John suggests that they immediately leave the forest and return to the city. They run together, fighting the overwhelming feeling that something is about to grab them. The sound of whispers increases, and the shadows try to reach their prey. The trio finally reach the edge of the forest, and for a moment they believe they are safe. But as she looks back, Sarah sees something that makes her freeze in place. A human figure made entirely of shadows, watching them from inside the forest. It was the same presence she and the others had seen before, but now much closer, much more real. The figure raises a hand, and for a moment the air around them to move. John shouts for them to run, and they all rush towards the city, but now they know, the shadows have followed them. Havenbrook is under attack. When Sarah, Claire and John arrive back in town, the scene is chaotic. The shadows, which were once intended for the forest, have now infiltrated Havenbrook. The city lights flicker, and haunting whispers echo through the deserted streets. People are locked in their homes, but even so, some have fallen, swallowed by the darkness. Elena, upon seeing the state of the teenagers, finally believes John's stories. She knew something strange was happening, but she never thought it would be something so dangerous. Now, with shadows moving across the city, she teams up with John and the teens to formulate a plan. "This is not something natural. We can't face them alone," says John, his voice shaking as he tries to control his growing fear. Elena looks at the teenagers, still panting and terrified. "We need to get the city together and figure out how to figure this out. If there's a way," she responds, trying to fly confidently but knowing time is running out. Suddenly, the sound of a scream interrupted the group. It comes from the central square. They run towards the sound, but when they get there, they see only emptiness. In the middle of the square, where the city lights once were, there is now only darkness. Shadows have moved into the heart of Havenbrook. Sarah, eyes wide, whispers, "They're here." The camera slowly ascends, showing the deserted streets of the city, with small movements of shadows visible throughout, as if the city is being surrounded. As the group contemplates what to do, something approaches them. A figure begins to emerge from the shadows, visible only by the sinister glow of its eyes. The entity appears human, but its body is made up of pure darkness. The whispers grow louder and the feeling of fear grows. John recognizes a creature. "It's her. Something that let me come back." His face turns pale and he whispers to Elena, "If she's here, that means we don't have much time." The episode ends with a shadowy figure approaching, the shadows swallowing the city and the protagonists paralyzed by the tension.